Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to speak to you about something many of us struggle with, yet rarely confront. It's a habit that's been ingrained in us since childhood, a trait we mistakenly believe is synonymous with being a good person. That habit is being too soft to everyone around us. And I'm not talking about compassion or kindness, those are strengths, not weaknesses. I'm talking about the tendency to bend over backwards, to say yes when your spirit is screaming no, and to pour out your energy until you're running on empty, all because you think it's the right thing to do. But let me ask you, how many times have you walked away from a situation feeling drained, exhausted, and honestly resentful? How often have you gone along to get along, only to find that your own needs were sidelined, your voice unheard? You see, being soft isn't about kindness or grace, it's about the fear of standing up for yourself. And that's a fear we've got to unlearn. Because every time you allow someone to cross a boundary you never established, you teach them that your boundaries don't define respect. Without them, people will only treat you the way you've taught them to treat you. They'll continue to ask more, take more, and give less. And when you give in every single time, you reinforce a dangerous message that their needs are more important than yours. Let me tell you this, the power of no is transformative. Saying no doesn't mean you're mean, unkind, or selfish. Saying no is an act of self-preservation. It's standing up and declaring, I matter too. You don't have to show up for every argument or rescue every person in distress. When you do that, you are diluting your strength. You're pouring from a cup that's already half empty, leaving nothing for yourself. And what good are you to anyone when you're running on fumes? Some of you think avoiding conflict is keeping the peace. But what it's really doing is sacrificing your own peace. You end up holding on to silent resentments, unspoken frustrations, and a lingering feeling of being undervalued. That's not peace, it's a ticking time bomb. It's stress and anxiety just waiting for the right moment to explode. So here's the truth, when you respect yourself enough to stand firm, you're actually empowering others too. You're showing them what self-worth looks like. You're saying, this is what I deserve, and this is what you should expect for yourself. That's not harshness, it's clarity. And clarity is a gift we rarely give others. I'm not telling you to be callous or indifferent. Be compassionate, be kind, be giving, but know your limits. Know when it's time to stand up and say, enough. I deserve better than this. Because when you stop being soft, when you stop sacrificing yourself at the altar of others' expectations, something beautiful happens. You start attracting people who respect your boundaries, who value your time and energy, and who meet you at your level of worth. And isn't that what we all want? To be surrounded by people who uplift us, not drain us. So starting today, don't confuse softness with kindness. Don't confuse accommodation with love. And most importantly, don't confuse self-sacrifice with strength. You are worthy of being heard, being valued, and being respected without being soft to everyone. Stand strong, speak your truth, and watch as your world transforms around you. Being overly accommodating to others is a behavior that often stems from a deep-seated desire to be accepted, appreciated, and to avoid conflict. It's a pattern many of us fall into, mistakenly believing that the more we bend, the more we're loved and valued. But there's a stark difference between kindness and the habit of being soft to everyone. Kindness is a strength that comes from a place of compassion and empathy, where boundaries are respected. Being soft, however, often means letting people cross those boundaries repeatedly, leading to a loss of self-respect and emotional exhaustion. One of the most common reasons people become too accommodating is rooted in the fear of disappointing others. From a young age, many of us are taught to be agreeable, polite, and avoid confrontation at all costs. We grow up thinking that saying no is synonymous with being difficult or rude. So we go along with what others want, even when it's not aligned with our own needs. We say yes. When we're already stretched thin, we smile when we're uncomfortable, and we agree to things we'd rather not do, all to keep the peace and maintain an image of being easygoing. But this behavior comes at a high cost. When you consistently put others' needs above your own, you teach people how to treat you. Every time you say yes when you want to say no, you reinforce the idea that your own preferences and boundaries don't matter. Over time, people come to expect this level of compliance, and you find yourself in situations where others take more, ask for more, and give less. It's not that they're malicious or mean-spirited, it's just that you've trained them to see you as someone whose limits are negotiable. And once those boundaries are blurred, regaining that respect becomes an uphill battle. Being soft is not just about how others see you, but how you see yourself. When you allow yourself to be pushed around or taken for granted, it slowly erodes your self-esteem. You start feeling less confident, less valued, and less important. The resentment builds, and the energy you once had gets drained away. You end up exhausted, not because you're doing too much, but because you're doing too much that doesn't align with your true self. And that disconnect between who you are and what you're doing is what leads to burnout and dissatisfaction. The key issue here is that many people mistake avoidance of conflict for peacekeeping. But avoiding conflict doesn't mean you're maintaining peace. It means you're suppressing your own needs and desires for the sake of others. What looks like harmony on the outside is actually internal turmoil. You might avoid an argument today, but the resentment you're holding on to will surface in other ways. It might come out as passive-aggressive comments, sudden emotional outbursts, or worse, a sense of bitterness that taints your relationships. This silent frustration not only affects your interactions with others, but also your inner peace and overall well-being. What's needed is a shift in perspective. Instead of viewing firmness as harshness, see it as a form of self-respect. Saying no or setting clear boundaries doesn't make you mean or inconsiderate. It's a way of communicating that your time, energy, and needs are just as important as anyone else's. When you stand up for yourself, you're not rejecting others, you're embracing your own worth. This isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation. And the surprising truth is, when you respect yourself enough to enforce your boundaries, you gain respect from others too. They see you as someone with integrity and clarity, someone who knows their value and isn't afraid to defend it. People often fear that by being less accommodating, they'll lose relationships or face backlash. But real, meaningful relationships are built on mutual respect and understanding. When you set boundaries, you're not pushing people away, you're inviting them to engage with you on healthier, more respectful terms. Those who truly value you will appreciate your honesty and integrity, while those who were only there for what they could get will naturally fall away. It might feel uncomfortable at first, but in the long run, you'll find yourself surrounded by people who see your worth and reciprocate your energy. Being soft might seem like the easiest way to avoid conflict and please everyone, but it's actually a path that leads to personal dissatisfaction and strained relationships. When you stop being soft to everyone, you reclaim your power. You start living life on your terms, making choices that honor who you are and what you want. It's not about shutting people out or becoming unkind. It's about showing up as your authentic self and expecting the same level of respect and consideration you offer to others. When you make this shift, you transform not only how others see you, but also how you see yourself. Being overly accommodating to everyone in your life often results in a significant loss of respect and blurred boundaries. When we prioritize being agreeable and compliant, we inadvertently signal to others that our personal needs and values are secondary. This leads to a situation where people may start to view us as pushovers, assuming that they can rely on us to yield to their wishes, regardless of our own preferences. The more we continue to accommodate without asserting our boundaries, the more entrenched this perception becomes, and the cycle of one-sided respect solidifies. Without boundaries, relationships can become imbalanced and unhealthy. Boundaries are more than just lines in the sand. They are essential markers that define how we expect to be treated. They are the unspoken rules that guide interactions, ensuring that there's mutual respect and understanding. When boundaries are missing or not clearly articulated, people often take liberties that wouldn't be possible otherwise. This can manifest in various ways: someone expecting you to drop everything for them at a moment's notice, or relying on you to solve problems they could easily handle themselves. Over time, these behaviors become the norm, not because the other person is necessarily ill-intentioned, but because you've allowed it through your actions or lack thereof. In the absence of clear boundaries, respect slowly erodes, replaced by a pattern. The process of reclaiming respect and establishing boundaries begins with understanding the power of saying no. Many of us have been conditioned to view the word no as inherently negative or dismissive. We fear that declining a request might lead to conflict, disappointment, or even rejection. But saying no is not a sign of weakness or rudeness. In fact, it's a powerful declaration of self-worth and personal value. When you say no, you are affirming your right to have time, space, and energy for yourself. You are acknowledging that your own priorities are just as important as anyone else's. This doesn't mean that you should reject every request that comes your way. but rather that you should weigh the impact on yourself before automatically agreeing. The key is discernment, deciding when to give and when to hold back so that your resources, whether they be emotional, physical, or mental, are not depleted. Over-accommodating behavior is often rooted in a desire to please others or to be seen as helpful and cooperative. While there's nothing inherently wrong with being helpful, the problem arises when it becomes an obligation rather than a choice. This tendency to over-accommodate often stems from a deeper psychological drive, such as a fear of rejection, a desire for approval, or a need to avoid conflict at all costs. This people-pleasing mindset creates a cycle where self-worth becomes tied to how much you can do for others, often to your own detriment. Every time you prioritize someone else's needs over your own, you send a subtle message to yourself that your needs don't matter. This can lead to feelings of resentment, frustration, and even burnout as you struggle to meet the endless demands placed on you while neglecting your own well-being. The difference between self-preservation and people-pleasing lies in the intent and outcome of your actions. When you engage in people-pleasing, your actions are motivated by external validation and a fear of negative perceptions. Self-preservation, on the other hand, is motivated by a desire to maintain your well-being and protect your resources. It's a recognition that you have limits and that exceeding those limits repeatedly will harm you in the long run. Establishing boundaries is not about shutting people out or being selfish. It's about creating a sustainable way to interact with others, where giving is done from a place of abundance rather than obligation. When you practice self-preservation, you are not only looking out for yourself, but also ensuring that you have the capacity to give to others meaningfully when the time is right. People often confuse avoiding conflict with maintaining peace, believing that if they sidestep issues or keep quiet about their concerns, harmony will prevail. However, this kind of false peace is built on a shaky foundation. When you suppress your own needs or feelings to avoid potential discord, you are sacrificing your internal peace. Unaddressed issues linger in the background, festering into resentment and internal conflict. The temporary quiet bought by avoiding a disagreement comes at the cost of long-term emotional turmoil. True peace comes not from the absence of conflict, but from the resolution of it. It requires having the courage to express your thoughts and feelings honestly and respectfully, even when it's uncomfortable. By addressing conflicts head-on, you clear the air and pave the way for healthier, more authentic relationships. The act of standing firm and setting boundaries not only protects your own well-being, but also teaches others how to treat you. When you assert your boundaries, you demonstrate that your time and energy are valuable. This encourages others to respect your limits and, in turn, establishes a dynamic of mutual respect. It may be challenging at first, especially if you're not used to asserting yourself, but over time, people will learn to honor your boundaries. They will understand that when you give, you do so freely and willingly, not out of obligation or fear. This shift can transform relationships, bringing them into alignment with your true values and expectations. The concept of being too soft often relates to the idea of being overly accommodating, excessively agreeable, or overly concerned with pleasing others to the point of neglecting one's own needs. It's a mindset and behavior pattern that many people fall into, thinking it's synonymous with kindness or compassion. But the reality is far more complex. There is a difference between showing empathy and letting others walk over you. Understanding this difference is crucial for personal well-being, growth, and maintaining healthy relationships. One of the key aspects that contribute to being too soft is the lack of boundaries. Boundaries define the limits of what we are comfortable with and what we are willing to accept from others. When we don't establish these boundaries, it's easy for others to take advantage, whether consciously or unconsciously. This often happens when we feel an internal pressure to be liked or accepted by others. People who are too soft frequently equate being accommodating with gaining approval and forming connections. However, this approval is often superficial and can lead to relationships that are one-sided and draining. Being too soft often means avoiding conflict at all costs. There's a belief that saying no or standing up for oneself will lead to rejection, criticism, or confrontation. But conflict isn't necessarily negative. It can be an opportunity for growth, understanding, and mutual respect when handled correctly. When someone consistently avoids conflict, they're often suppressing their true feelings and desires. Over time, this can lead to frustration, resentment, and a sense of being taken for granted. It's not just about saying no to others, but about saying yes to yourself, your values, your needs, and your priorities. It's a declaration that your feelings matter just as much as anyone else's. Another factor is the fear of losing relationships or upsetting others. People who are too soft often believe that if they were to assert themselves, they would be pushing others away or would be seen as difficult. This fear of abandonment or rejection can be rooted in early childhood experiences or past traumas, where assertiveness led to negative consequences. To prevent this, such individuals learn to mold themselves into what others want them to be, compromising their own identity and desires in the process. But the irony is that by doing so, they lose touch with who they really are and end up feeling more isolated and misunderstood than if they had spoken up from the start. People-pleasing, a common trait of those who are too soft, is exhausting. It requires constant monitoring of others' emotions, anticipating their needs, and adjusting one's own behavior to keep others happy. The underlying issue is often a sense of worthlessness or the belief that one's value is determined by how much they can do for others. This mindset can be dangerous because it leads to an unbalanced dynamic where the person is always giving but rarely receiving. Over time, this can lead to burnout, emotional exhaustion, and a sense of being unappreciated. Even worse, it can attract people who seek to exploit such tendencies, creating toxic relationships where the giver's needs are never acknowledged or met. Understanding one's own worth is essential to breaking free from this pattern. It's about recognizing that you are deserving of the same respect, consideration, and care that you give to others. When you value yourself, you are less likely to tolerate disrespect or unfair treatment. You begin to set boundaries not as a means of pushing others away, but as a way of preserving your own mental and emotional health. It's a shift from seeking validation from others to finding validation within yourself. This shift doesn't mean becoming indifferent or unkind. It means being authentic and true to oneself while still being compassionate and understanding. Often, those who are too soft avoid setting boundaries because they fear it will make them look harsh or unkind. But boundaries, when communicated properly, do the exact opposite. They foster respect and clarity. People know where they stand with you, what you're comfortable with, and how to engage with you in a way that is healthy and mutually beneficial. Without boundaries, people can unintentionally or intentionally overstep, leading to negative interactions and strained relationships. When boundaries are in place, interactions are more likely to be respectful and considerate, creating a healthier dynamic. Ultimately, breaking free from the pattern of being too soft means confronting fears of rejection, learning to tolerate discomfort, and being willing to advocate for oneself. It's about realizing that you don't have to sacrifice your own happiness for the sake of others. By standing up for your own needs and expressing yourself honestly, you build stronger, more authentic relationships where both parties' needs are recognized and respected. It's not an overnight change, but it's a process that leads to a greater sense of self-worth, inner peace, and healthier interactions with the people around you. Being kind should never come at the expense of your own well-being, and learning to balance kindness with firmness is a powerful step towards personal empowerment. Being soft toward everyone can often seem like a virtue. It's typically associated with being kind, compassionate, and understanding. Yet, when we examine what it truly means to be soft, it often results in a loss of self-respect, a depletion of personal energy, and a weakening of our boundaries. People often fail to realize that being too accommodating, too agreeable, and too willing to let things slide can do more harm than good, not only to the individual, but also to the relationships they are trying to nurture. One of the most significant impacts of being too soft is the erosion of boundaries. Boundaries are not about keeping people out. They're about defining how people can treat you, how much they can ask of you, and how far they can go in your personal space emotionally, mentally, and physically. When you're too lenient and constantly put others' needs ahead of your own, it sends a message that your limits are flexible, that your personal space can be compromised, and that your needs aren't as important. Over time, this can lead to a dynamic where others might unintentionally or intentionally take advantage of you. This dynamic does not foster mutual respect or genuine connection. It breeds dependency, resentment, and a lack of respect for your personhood. Being too soft also affects your self-perception and self-worth. Every time you override your own feelings to please someone else, you chip away at your own sense of self. You start internalizing the notion that what you feel, need, or desire isn't as valuable or significant as what others expect from you. This mentality can become deeply ingrained, leading to a diminished sense of identity and self-respect. When you constantly say yes to things you'd rather say no to, you're not just accommodating someone else's needs, you're betraying your own. This betrayal of self can manifest as inner turmoil, stress, and anxiety. It's a slow process of eroding your confidence as you teach yourself that standing up for what you believe or desire isn't worth the conflict or discomfort it may cause. Additionally, there's the matter of energy. Emotional energy is finite, and being excessively soft and giving can deplete your resources. Constantly being available for others, listening to their problems, and putting aside your own challenges to support them may seem noble, but it leaves you with little energy for self-care, reflection, or growth. When your own emotional tank is empty, you're not in a position to help anyone effectively, not yourself and not others. People may begin to rely on you as their emotional crutch, creating an unhealthy dependency. As a result, you may find yourself overwhelmed, stressed, and unable to cope with your own emotions. The irony here is that in trying to be there for everyone, you become less capable of being there for anyone in a meaningful way. Being soft also has a broader social impact. In professional settings, for instance, being too accommodating can be interpreted as a lack of assertiveness or even competence. If you're always saying yes to every project, task, or responsibility, colleagues and superiors might start to overlook your capacity to lead or handle more complex roles. You may get stuck in a cycle of mundane tasks, missing out on opportunities for growth and advancement because you're perceived as someone who can't say no or who doesn't prioritize their own workload and career trajectory. In personal relationships, being overly accommodating can lead to a loss of respect. People might appreciate your willingness to help and support, but they also sense when someone lacks a firm sense of self. When you're too soft, you may find people taking liberties with your time, emotions, or resources, leading to an imbalance in the relationship where one person's needs and desires dominate. To complicate things further, being soft is often rooted in a desire to avoid conflict and keep the peace. However, avoiding conflict at all costs rarely results in genuine peace. Instead, it creates a facade of harmony underpinned by a bed of unresolved issues, unspoken frustrations, and lingering resentments. This avoidance can eventually lead to passive-aggressive behavior, withdrawal, or an emotional breakdown when the weight of all those unmet needs and unexpressed emotions becomes too heavy to bear. Conflict, when handled respectfully and openly, can lead to growth and deeper understanding. But by being too soft, you're sidestepping the very conversations that could bring about real change and clarity. Lastly, consider how being too soft might impact the very people you're trying to protect or support. When you accommodate everyone's needs, you deny them the opportunity to grow, adapt, or face the consequences of their actions. If you're always saying yes to requests, even when it inconveniences you, you teach others that they don't have to consider your time or energy. If you continually bail people out of their problems, they never learn to solve those problems on their own. By being overly soft, you inadvertently stunt their growth, perpetuating a cycle of dependency that's unhealthy for both parties. The lesson here is not to become harsh or unkind, but to find a balance where your kindness does not come at the cost of your own well-being. Being too soft often leads to a lack of boundaries, where people may feel they can take advantage of you or your kindness. This issue isn't just about accommodating others, it's about unintentionally teaching people that your limits don't matter, thereby diminishing the respect they have for you. When you're constantly available, always agreeable, and never voice your discomfort, you set a precedent. People begin to think that it's okay to call on you anytime, to push their needs over yours, and to disregard your time and energy. It's not just their fault, it's a behavior you've enabled by being too lenient. This doesn't mean that kindness should be withheld. Kindness is powerful when exercised with respect for oneself and others. However, when it's paired with a lack of boundaries, it ceases to be kindness and becomes a form of self-neglect. Without boundaries, people can begin to see you as someone they can always rely on, someone who will always say yes, regardless of the cost to your own well-being. Over time, this erodes respect in relationships because people assume that you don't value your own needs. They begin to believe that their demands are justified, no matter how unreasonable they might be. The absence of boundaries is like a door that's always left ajar, inviting everyone in, even when you're not ready to host. saying no is one of the most effective ways to build self-respect and command respect from others. It's a statement that your time, energy, and priorities matter. But many struggle with the idea of saying no because they equate it with rejection or conflict. There's a fear that saying no might disappoint others or make them think less of you. However, the truth is that saying no establishes you as a person of value, someone who respects their own limits and isn't afraid to protect their time and well-being. A no said with firmness and respect carries far more weight than a yes given reluctantly or out of guilt. It sets a clear boundary, communicating to others that you are not at their beck and call, that you have a life, needs, and priorities that must also be respected. People who matter will understand, and those who don't will reveal themselves in their reactions. It's not about rejecting others, it's about rejecting the idea that their needs always come before yours. This shift in thinking helps others see you as someone who is assertive, confident, and worth respecting. They begin to understand that your time isn't limitless and that you're not afraid to decline when it's in your best interest. People-pleasing behavior often stems from a deep desire to be liked and accepted. It's a behavior rooted in fear, the fear of rejection, of being seen as unkind or unhelpful. But in trying to avoid these fears, you create a different problem. You end up overextending yourself, compromising your own happiness, and becoming a version of yourself that is defined by what others want, not who you truly are. The constant need to please others becomes a burden. It's exhausting to live up to everyone's expectations because no matter how much you give, someone will always want more. The more you give, the less people appreciate it because it's expected, not earned. People-pleasing becomes a cycle that drains you emotionally and mentally and leaves you with a feeling of emptiness because your own needs are consistently overlooked. When you spend all your time trying to make others happy, you lose sight of what makes you happy. And when you lose yourself in the process, you're not truly serving anyone, not even those you're trying to please. Avoiding conflict might seem like a way to keep the peace, but it often results in sacrificing your own peace of mind. It's easy to believe that saying nothing or going along with what others want is keeping harmony intact, but silence can be dangerous. Every unspoken grievance, every unmet need that you bury for the sake of avoiding confrontation turns into resentment. Over time, resentment builds into bitterness, and bitterness leads to emotional burnout. You end up feeling like a victim in your own life, even though it was your decision to remain silent. The cost of avoiding conflict is steep. It's your self-respect, your happiness, and your ability to assert yourself. Being willing to engage in difficult conversations doesn't mean inviting conflict. It means valuing your own voice enough to express it. It's not about fighting or winning an argument. It's about ensuring that your perspective is heard and considered. When you choose to speak up instead of shrinking back, you reclaim your power and stop feeling like a passenger in your own life. Empowering others begins with standing firm in your own values and expectations. When you're clear about what you will and won't tolerate, people know where they stand with you. They begin to see you as someone who values themselves, and that's inspiring. It challenges them to reflect on how they value themselves as well. You teach people how to treat you by the standards you set. When you allow others to overstep your boundaries, you're silently saying, it's okay to treat me this way. But when you set expectations and stick to them, you command a different level of respect. You become a mirror for others to see what self-respect and self-worth look like in action. This isn't about dominance or control. It's about leading by example and showing others that true respect starts with respecting yourself. When you stop being soft and start standing strong, you inspire others to do the same. In this way, you uplift those around you by being a model of strength and self-assurance. Being too soft to everyone around you often stems from a genuine desire to be liked, accepted, and seen as a good person. It might start with small concessions, staying late at work, even when you're exhausted, lending a hand when you're overwhelmed, or simply agreeing with someone to avoid conflict. But over time, these seemingly minor actions accumulate, shaping how others perceive you and how you perceive yourself. It's a pattern that many fall into, believing that saying yes or remaining agreeable will lead to harmony and mutual respect. In reality, it can create a cycle where people begin to see you as someone who doesn't have personal boundaries, someone whose time, energy, and emotions are readily available for their consumption, no matter the cost to you. When boundaries are blurred or non-existent, respect becomes a casualty. You may think being overly accommodating will earn you the respect and appreciation of others, but it often has the opposite effect. People learn quickly which individuals they can lean on, sometimes too heavily. Without clear boundaries, there's no line to indicate when they've gone too far, which leads to relationships that are unbalanced and exploitative. This is not to suggest that others are always malicious in their intent, but rather that they respond to the conditions you set. If you present yourself as someone who can always be relied upon to say yes, it's only natural that they'll continue to ask, not out of a lack of respect, but because you've shown them it's permissible. Respect in any relationship is born out of mutual understanding, and that understanding begins with the boundaries you set. Saying no might feel uncomfortable, especially if you're used to accommodating everyone's needs at the expense of your own. It might feel like rejection, like you're being difficult or unkind. However, the power of no is not in its rejection, but in its affirmation of self-worth. It's a declaration that your time, energy, and well-being are valuable and not to be squandered on things that deplete you. Learning to say no is an act of self-respect. It's about understanding that your capacity to give is not infinite, and that you must preserve your own resources to be able to give meaningfully when it truly matters. Every time you say no to something that drains you, you're saying yes to something that fulfills you. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or cold. It means understanding that your yes is most powerful when it's given freely, not out of obligation or guilt. There's a distinction between being kind and being a people pleaser. Kindness enriches relationships and builds genuine connections, while people-pleasing depletes you and creates a relationship dynamic where your needs are secondary, if not invisible. When you're constantly putting others first, it's easy to lose sight of your own identity and desires. The reality is, people-pleasing doesn't make you a better person. It makes you a person who is always at the mercy of others' opinions. When your self-worth is tied to how much you can do for others, it becomes a cycle that's hard to break. You give and give, hoping to receive validation in return, but instead you find yourself feeling increasingly hollow and underappreciated. The more you give in this state, the more you sacrifice your own peace and contentment, until you're left wondering if the sacrifices were ever truly worth it. Being soft doesn't mean you have to be in constant agreement with everyone or always avoid conflict. Avoiding conflict might seem like the easiest path to keep the peace, but in reality, it's a way of sacrificing your own peace. It's not truly peaceful to suppress your thoughts, needs, and desires. When you avoid standing up for yourself, you're essentially telling yourself that your voice doesn't matter as much as others. Over time, this silencing of your own voice can lead to feelings of resentment and frustration. Resentment towards those who seem to take advantage of your kindness, and frustration with yourself for not being able to speak up. These emotions can fester, creating internal conflict and damaging your own self-image. Conflict, when approached with respect and honesty, can actually lead to stronger, more authentic relationships. It's in these moments that you assert who you are and what you stand for, which leads to relationships where your needs and boundaries are understood and respected. It's important to remember that when you establish and maintain boundaries, you're not only doing so for yourself, but for others as well. When you stand firm, you're modeling self-respect, showing people that it's possible to care for others without losing yourself in the process. This clarity allows others to understand what to expect from you and how to engage with you in a way that is mutually beneficial. It's not about pushing people away or being unapproachable. It's about setting a precedent for how you deserve to be treated. By doing so, you empower those around you to also honor their own boundaries, creating healthier dynamics built on respect rather than obligation. The transformation begins when you recognize that softness, as it's often practiced, isn't synonymous with strength. True strength comes from knowing when to say no, when to stand your ground, and when to prioritize yourself, even if it means facing discomfort or disapproval. This isn't about rejecting others, it's about embracing yourself. By ceasing to be so soft, you're not becoming harsh or uncaring. You're becoming a person who understands their worth and refuses to be diminished by anyone else's expectations. That is where true power lies. When you stop being soft to everyone, you begin to reclaim your own power, set clear boundaries, and cultivate respect in all your relationships. It's about choosing self-preservation over people-pleasing and embracing the strength that comes from standing firm in who you are. Remember, you can still be compassionate and kind without sacrificing your own well-being. The most meaningful relationships are built on mutual respect and understanding, not on bending over backwards to accommodate everyone else's needs. When you prioritize your own worth, you encourage others to value you too. That's not selfish, that's self-respect. Stand strong, say no when you need to, and trust that the right people will appreciate you for it. Good luck on your journey to finding your voice, your boundaries, and your true sense of self. Thank you for listening, and may you continue to grow stronger, more empowered, and more confident in who you are.